We're back with another Engineers podcast. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're back into the realms of AI, and in particular, in the life sciences space. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Lung, CTO at Faro Health. Faro Health specializes in streamlining the design and execution of complex clinical trials for the pharma world. We're going to be touching on a number of their AI use cases, proving performance and speed in the clinical trial process. And I'm sure Patrick's got a couple of other nuggets for us along the way. Patrick, thanks for coming to join us.
Thanks, Elliot. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Give us a bit of a background into who's Patrick.
Sure. I give a series of different talks at work about professional development, and one of them, I have a slide on me. And I guess I have been in the tech industry for pretty much my whole career, both in the role of a startup entrepreneur, as well as working for big companies like Google. So when I was at Google, at one point, I joined a team that was really deeply using AI in a really significant way to conduct lifelike conversations with people over the phone. And that was launched at the Google I/O conference to great fanfare. And that was my initial foray into AI and data science and so on. And since then, I've built a career basically as a AI CTO. So after Google, I joined Two Sigma Investments, which is an algorithmic hedge fund and based in New York, and was really working on figuring out how to apply data science and AI to private investing, both private equity and venture. So that was super interesting to take a break from building tech products and going into the world of tech-driven investing. I learned a lot about the way the world works from that experience. And then I started my own company for a while doing essentially tropical reforestation modeling. And so the idea was to essentially use forecasts for the growth of tropical rainforests in order to essentially underwrite carbon credits. And so we had this way of carbon financing various reforestation and conservation projects, which is really cool. We've done, tens of thousands of hectares of reforestation in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and so on. And then I joined Faro Health, and this was the first time I'd really seriously thought about life sciences, despite considering becoming a doctor when I was a kid, because my father is quite a well-known doctor in Hong Kong. Um, and in some ways, this was a way for me to really learn more about my dad and his field, and he was super excited about me doing this. And so, essentially, it's been really, really interesting to get up to speed on how clinical drug trials work, the ins and outs of how to make them more effective and efficient, better for sponsors and patients and sites as well. And that's been my gig for the past better part of a year and a half, 2 years at Faro Health.
Love it. Before we touch on Faro Health, you've seen and done this AI thing now for a long time. I wanted you to intro the Google, the Two Sigma, the reforestation. What what are you noticing at the moment with the narrative in AI, the changes in AI, and just the sheer speed of how fast we're moving in AI?
Yeah, I think the really striking thing is that it wasn't so long ago that AI was this very esoteric thing that people barely even sort of were aware of. It was just, oh yeah, there's all these AI-driven features like, um, image recognition was a big revolution that happened maybe 10 years ago, but it wasn't something that was in people's hands. And so I find it so fascinating once these large language models came along, how they became as ubiquitous as Google, as like a search engine. And I think Jacob Nielsen, who's a usability expert, like sort of one of the real founders of the field of user experience, he puts it best, like he says that this is a new paradigm in how we interact with machines. And so in the past, we've had these various other epochs of ways of interacting, like whether it's feeding, cards into a batch system where it's processed overnight, and that got sort of disrupted and supplanted by telling the computer what to do, whether it's using a mouse or a keyboard or whatever. And now we're in this kind of third era of interacting with machines, which is essentially expressing your intent using natural language. And that's a really remarkable thing. It's resulted in AI just becoming this ubiquitous thing that's on people's minds, and it's just a huge shift. And so as a result, there's been tons of obviously resources and investment and time and effort being poured into evolving these systems, and the rate of evolution and progression is really, really um, striking. During my talks, I was just at a conference last week actually talking about this, where you look at the graphs of how how AI is kind of reaching and surpassing human performance in various tasks. And in the old days, it was like handwriting recognition. It took like decades, and then you had like recognizing objects visually, which took maybe 5 to 10 years. And now the latest Stanford AI report, which graphs all this stuff, says that there's this test which essentially is like grad PhD level science questions that are super hard for humans to answer. And these AI models went from very, very middling performance, less than 40%, to 100% plus in the space of a year, which is just crazy, right? So the pace of innovation is going up because of all this, commercial interest from companies, arising from companies like OpenAI and, Google and so on, and just pouring billions of dollars into these technologies.
Yeah, it really, really is nuts. We're going to come to some of this. Intro, Faro Health, what you're building, what the mission of the business is.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I was really shocked by this when I first joined this company and I started learning about the life sciences industry and what it takes to bring a pharmaceutical, like a new drug, to market. And in tech, we have this thing called Moore's law that maybe many of the listeners have heard of, which is essentially the fact that silicon chip density doubles every 18 months, right? This is this law that's held more or less for the last 50, 60 years. So we have our own version of that in life sciences, which is Eroom's law, which is more spelled backwards. It's kind of dark humor, whereby the cost and time required to bring a drug to market doubles every 9 years. So it's not 18 months, but 9 years over the course of inflation adjusted over the course of 50, 60 years has resulted in this kind of exponential increase in drug costs. And essentially what that means is that all this innovation going on in drug discovery, genetic medicine, all this kind of thing. There's incredible things happening at the early stage of this process, but it gets sort of bottlenecked and gummed up, and there's all these barriers to entry for new biotech companies trying to bring these drugs to market. And so Faro was really built on the insight that and so basically it's stunningly this really stunned me when I first found it out, but these drug trials essentially that plot out the next 10 years of a drug's path to market, and this is a $1 to $2 billion process to bring a drug to market these days. It's done in Microsoft Word. And to me, that's just my catch cry was like, not even Excel. It's not even Excel, right? And this is like highly structured, highly complex, highly domain specific information. And so Faro was built with this premise that we can do way better than that. So we've got this really advanced SaaS product that gives clinical scientists this really advanced tool to very rapidly model a trial, whether it's a super complex oncology trial or a simpler immunology trial or whatever. There's a wide range of different types of trials out there, depending on the therapeutic area and so on. And you can very rapidly gain insights like analytics that tell you, here's the patient burden of this trial, here's the complexity, the cost, the time to market, all this kind of thing. And as time goes on, as we apply AI, we get more and more advanced analytics. And so we help drug companies to develop better clinical trials that are better for patients and faster to market and lower cost and better for sites and so on. So that's the premise of the company, is that it's a design tool that replaces Microsoft Word. We integrate with Microsoft Word so you can still do all your clinical documentation. Only, we can do it 20 times faster using AI. But essentially, it's a design tool to help to really kind of open up that bottleneck, to remove that bottleneck to creating trials and getting these drugs to market.
Love that. Clear message from you when we were first introduced was we're using AI to improve speed, performance. Walk us through that. Like, walk us through an understanding of how you are improving the speed and performance in clinical trials using AI and how.
Yeah, there are 3 or 4 main areas, so I guess I'll just summarize them, and then we can sort of dive into them more deeply. The first area is the most obvious one, which is clinical writing. So currently, there's an inordinate amount of time and effort spent preparing clinical documentation, starting with the clinical trial protocol document, which is essentially the blueprint for the trial. It outlines all the different procedures, all the objectives, all of the ways that the trial population is organized. And this document is highly complex and can be, can run 200 or more pages, and it contains various diagrams and tables and lots of footnotes and all this kind of complexity. And currently, that's a really major um, process to put that document together. The stakes are high because it's sent to the regulators for review, very intense review, as you can imagine. And there's tons of human error, there's tons of duplication. This document is then used as an input to generating a whole plethora of other documents further down the line in the clinical trial's lifetime. And so we are automating that using AI. And the good news is, Faro has this really well-organized, structured repository of clinical trial information about the design and so on. And so it's easier for us to actually generate this document because we have it all stored, all the relevant details stored in the database, and with this really nice design tool and analytics and everything. And so you have this beautiful kind of complementary system where you have this purpose-built design tool and you have this AI authoring tool in Microsoft Word that's using generative AI to generate this clinical documentation. So that's one area. Another is basically processing a bunch of clinical trials that are already out there in the world. So we have hundreds of thousands of these protocol documents that have already been essentially posted on the internet and are available as PDF documents, and in some cases, Microsoft Word documents. And so we can take those documents and parse them using AI, do this kind of graph rag analysis that gives us the really rich view of what's contained in the knowledge contained in that document. And then we can make that information available in the form of benchmarking. So we can take your current trial under development and we can tell you which trials are similar to that trial based on a range of different comparison criteria, and then tell you like your trial seems to have a higher patient burden than others of its kind. Or meaning you might have trouble enrolling patients because the patient burden is too high, or sites might not want to even sign up for this trial because it's just too complex. And so we can give you some really advanced analytics by basically extracting all the knowledge from all these different unstructured Word documents and PDF documents and bringing them into this database. And then there's another area which is integration. So we have all this really valuable knowledge about the clinical trial, and there's all these other systems and processes downstream from the clinical design period that basically persist throughout the duration of the trial. So an example is site budgeting. Basically being able to provide the various sites that you're trying to kind of enroll, you're trying to sign up to participate in this trial and tell them how much this is going to cost. And we've built a system that essentially automates that process and produces these site budget reports pretty easily using AI. So that gives you a taste. Like there's a lot of different areas that we're applying this stuff, and it's really exciting. It's just the early stages, I think, both for this technology as well as for us in terms of applying it to this very complex process of designing clinical trials.
Love it. Even if we were to walk back 18 months, you joining the business, help us understand what that looks like day one, where you're walking in as a CTO, you're looking at various different AI use cases, maybe defining a strategy, understanding what use cases to prioritize and why, or do you run as a trifecta and try all of them? Walk us through that moment of you walking into the business and actually getting some of this AI off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a entrepreneur and kind of innovator, it was a dream scenario because Faro was already a fairly successful SaaS system, like conventional SaaS company. And Scott Chatham, the CEO, brought me on board to kind of bring AI into this company, meaning formulate a strategy, hire a team, and essentially help transform the company from a more of a conventional SaaS company into an AI-driven SaaS company. And it was just really super rewarding, super fun to just look at what's possible, do a bunch of experimentation, and try to figure out like what's the highest impact thing we can do here. And so I tried a bunch of things and we settled on the document generation as being the really big thing because we perceived that a lot of pharma companies out there and biotech companies are actually under pressure from their boards and from their other stakeholders to adopt this technology. So even if they themselves are pretty happy with the way they're operating, there's this kind of unusual situation where everybody is under pressure to start to use this technology. And so the most obvious way to do this is to automate an existing process, right? That's the kind of lower stakes way of doing things. And so let's just take something we already do and make it faster and better. And just given how everybody uses AI, which is usually to generate stuff, right? It's usually to say, oh, I want to write this email or do my homework or do some research and, give me some summary. And so we started with that and we did a whole bunch of trial and error around generating a protocol document. And we soon realized that there's a huge, huge difference between using it to write an email and using it to generate a really highly complex and specialized clinical document that needs to pass muster with the regulatory authorities. And so during the course of discovering and experimenting, we came up with a whole bunch of different techniques and practices and processes to make sure that that works really well.
And you did touch on an interesting point there: regulation. In a regulation and compliance heavy environment, a data rich environment that we've just spoken about as well. Walk us through what applying AI is like in a compliant or regulation heavy environment and some of the challenges that you're likely to walk into.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the stakes are really high in the sense that there's human lives involved in these clinical trials, and moreover, the regulatory authorities, understandably, have become more conservative over time. Like every time there's like an opioid crisis kind of situation where some substance or some drug that passed muster with the FDA ends up causing this unforeseen problem in society, from now on, that can't happen again. And so there's going to be extra attention applied in this case to studying what potentially other addictive um, effects might happen for people taking this medication. And so as a result, the document needs to really take into account like all the different, um, basically being as thorough as possible with the content and as correct as possible. And one of the really interesting and kind of sometimes annoying qualities of these large language models is they do hallucinate, right? They make things up and they're blissfully unaware of this, right? There's no kind of qualifier that says, I think I might be making this up. I'm only say 40% sure about what I'm saying right now. There's nothing like that. It's just not the way that large language models work. And so, of course, when we started playing with these models to try to apply them to generate various sections of the protocol document, we found that it was making stuff up. And not just that, but it was also missing things out. Like it was just neglecting to mention important things. And so what we realized is that we needed this whole other infrastructure to both to guide the prompt and make sure that it is really sufficient, as well as to evaluate the output of the large language model and make sure that it wasn't hallucinating. And so we had this whole kind of like agentic system. You hear that sort of term a lot. It's kind of really taking over the AI world, like agents that are purpose built and have a particular kind of a focus. So we have some agents that generate content. We have some agents that evaluate the truth, the quality of the content. We have other agents that ensure consistency of tone and style across multiple sections. We have other agents that go out there and do research and pull in information from various sources to be able to kind of like actually provide necessary inputs to generate certain sections in the protocol. So all these kind of purpose-built agents that have this kind of focused function. And so all that's to say that in order to kind of make the FDA happy and produce clinical documentation that is really of high clinical quality, it is necessary to have a lot more checks and balances and infrastructure to do that. And I think that this is done on a per subsection level. Like each subsection in the protocol is very, very different. And so the checklists that we use to evaluate the content have to be purpose-built for each section, which is quite laborious, but we've found various ways to speed that process up.
Yeah, nice. The agents part, I'm curious, walk us through what it's been like building specific purpose agents for different areas of the business, because we were going to touch on agents in the QA process, but I'm keen to get your experience using and deploying agents for different parts of the clinical trial process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the agent design pattern, because essentially it's an architecture. It arises very naturally. Like once you start applying large language models to do more complex tasks than just generating some piece of text, right? And so this whole idea of really specialization of having, because when we first started doing this, we just had essentially one agent, which generated a particular protocol section. And so we realized after a while, well, but we wanted to do this other thing as well. We wanted to check the output and we wanted to make sure the format is good. And so the agent architecture kind of arose out of this need for the large language model to do these different things. And it was just too much for one prompt or one session to try to do everything. And so I think it just evolved over time. It went from being just generating output to generating and evaluating to generating, evaluating, and refining, and then to styling, and then to researching and all these other things that we need to do. And it's been really kind of an interesting process of just looking out there as far as figuring out what other people are doing, looking at the literature as far as all the different agentic architectures out there, finding an infrastructure and a tool set that made sense, and then applying it and testing it out and so on. I think it's really hard to understate, or hard to overstate, I should say, how important human expertise is in here as well. Like the fact that we have a clinical scientist as our CEO and co-founder of the company, as well as a whole clinical team of writers and scientists to draw on to basically review the results and to see if we're heading in the right direction with respect to the quality and completeness of the documentation that we're generating.
Okay. Interestingly, what's their perspective?
The perspective is that it's while it's easy for the AI to slip and to just start making stuff up, it's actually getting better and better. So when we move to the latest versions of whether it's GPT or Claude or Gemini, because we use a range of different models in our system, it's been really striking to observe the increase in quality over time. So I think what that means is that we can, over time, really expand the capabilities of the system, expand the capacity to incorporate different document types, different use cases that might have been difficult with, say, GPT 3.5 or other systems that were, not too old. Like we're talking about sort of last year or the year before, but still, the current models are just so much more capable. And so I think that they're cautiously optimistic, whereas some of us on the more on the techie side are sort of enthusiastically optimistic.
Yeah, good. Good. Walk us through some of what you're introducing, even in your own AI, that you're doing to improve speed and performance.
Yeah, I mean, on the speed side, definitely it's important to start clustering the LLM, the large language model, because they are kind of slow. And it's even worse when you get multiple users using the system at the same time, because a system like ours, because it involves so much evaluation and kind of multiple attempts at generating content, and these agents operating in the background doing all these things, it's quite intensive as far as the usage of the language model. And so what we're finding is that in order to be able to support multiple users using the system at the same time, multiple customers, we need to actually start parallelizing and splitting things up. And so we've done a bit of work on that end. And then, of course, on the other end of it, there's the quality side of just looking at the content in detail, having all these very specific questions that we ask, like, are you following up with, does the section generated mention the need to follow up with the patient n number of weeks after they drop out of the trial or after they finish the trial? Like there's all these kind of nuances that we've observed over time are necessary to kind of check the content to make sure that it's there. And so those are a couple of examples of just how we're going about augmenting and adding to the capability of the LLM. Now, very few companies have the wherewithal or the sort of the resources to create a new foundation model. So we're not going there. Maybe at some point when we reach a certain scale as an organization, it might be necessary to do that. But I would only even consider actually fine tuning, let alone creating a new model if it's absolutely necessary. And we haven't found that that's the case yet. We found that, on the contrary, over time, as I mentioned before, the capabilities of the model are increasing such that actually they're meeting our needs, but we still need to do a bunch of work on top of them to be able to do what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, the parallelizing and um, the clustering notion, I think, is an interesting notion to take. What's your advice to people if they're looking at improving speed and performance of their own LLMs? How would you advise teams?
Yeah, I think because of the cost of these systems, using the state-of-the-art models gets expensive, right, in terms of the cost per token. And so you really have to model this out. Like this is good old-fashioned sort of financial modeling, right? Where you look at the anticipated usage of the system, you look at the amount of tokens on average that are being expended per query, you look at a common distribution of usage per user, and you do a bunch of kind of adding things up and multiplying to figure out, at this level of traffic or with this many users on the system, it's going to you anticipate it's going to cost a certain amount, or maybe some range, like a low versus a high. And I think that may bound, depending on what kind of system you're building. Like in enterprise, like we're dealing with a very small number of customers, these big pharma companies and biotech companies of the order of dozens of customers. And so the math really allows us to spend a relatively and also a high ticket price, right? This is enterprise software. And so low volume, high price means that we have, I guess, the wherewithal or the luxury to spend a bunch of tokens in order to deliver value to our customers. But if you're building a shopping service that's going to potentially have millions of users, you can't do that. Or a game, right? That has millions of users and they're sitting there in every single query, you're burning tokens. You're gonna have to be very, very careful and maybe use models that are not state of the art, that are where the token cost is orders of magnitude lower. Like that's the trade-off. It's really an optimization problem where you have traffic, you have complexity of the application, and you have the capabilities and cost of the model, and you need to kind of optimize that in order to build a viable business.
Nice. And talking about business, you've worked across a number of different businesses, solving different problems. I'm interested to understand and get your take on your experience building AI teams, number one, but experience building AI teams in life sciences, number two, and advice for people as well.
Yeah. Um, Hiring techies is already challenging, right? Like even forget about data science or AI or using the latest techniques. Just building a software team is one of the main things you do as a technical leader, right? It's the most important thing you do as a manager, I believe, is hiring and sort of holding the conceptual field of what the whole organization needs to do. And I give talks on this internally, like what does it take to be a successful professional? What does it take to be a great techie? And I always look for things like curiosity, um, passion, a demonstrated track record in terms of actually having impact, good judgment to the extent that you can measure that during the course of an interview. Like, does this person seem to have the ability to really think through a problem and express different solutions and make good decisions? But when you add the additional layer of data science and then more specifically large language models, and then even more specifically particular large language model experience, like using GraphRag or whatever. And then on top of that, experience, with clinical trials or life sciences in general, it starts getting really narrow. And so I'll give you an example. Like last year, it took 4 months of dedicated searching to find a principal data scientist. This year, it's taken 6 months of searching to find a couple of additional data scientists. So you need to be patient. And I think that there have been a few candidates that we've seen who seemed really good, but really lacked the communication skills or had certain personality quirks that just wouldn't work with our culture. And we said no. And I think it's really important to give a coding test. Like what we found was that a lot of candidates look amazing on paper and talked a really good game. Like, yeah, they understood the principles, they understood what RAG is, or like could talk a good game as far as applying large language models. But when it came to time to actually sit down at a notebook and essentially code up, like or at least even um, modify or enhance a RAG system, or look at a LangChain kind of base system and debug it or enhance it. It just most candidates fell down, and I don't think these tests were particularly hard, honestly. Like I don't think they were super challenging. And
Where's the
so
disparity there? Don't lose your train of thought, but where's the disparity there in being able to talk about it and being able to actually code debug it?
I think honestly that a lot of people out there really, really want to put AI on their resume and really want to be perceived as being someone who can do all these things. And so there is with AI, people are realizing, wow, if I don't have this on my resume, it's going to hurt my chances of getting a job. Or conversely, if I had this on my resume, it's going to open up opportunities that might not be available to me. And so I will kind of exaggerate or overstate or otherwise kind of market myself as an AI expert without necessarily having the requisite experience. And so I think as a hiring manager, it's really incumbent upon you to dig as deep as you can, dig as deep as you are able to validate that person's experience because of this kind of self-hyping effect that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Interesting. Where do you think we're going to be in the next 3 to 6 months? We're talking about models improving all the time. We're talking about skills of engineers. Where are you placing bets for the next 3 to 6 months in terms of what we might see generally across the AI sphere?
Yeah, I mean, in the next 3 to 6 months, um, for sure, what you're going to see is better AI coding tools. So when our team first started looking at coding tools like, I guess GitHub's early AI Copilot, it was sort of like a toy. It was kind of like, okay, wow, gee, it can suggest code. It's looking at what I'm doing and suggesting things, but no one really took it that seriously because it just wasn't that good. But now with the latest incarnation of tools like Cursor and using Anthropic Claude Sonnet 4, there's this kind of arms race going on out there. And in some ways, automated coding is the ultimate use case for rapidly advancing the state of the art in terms of the application of AI, because you can tell right away if it worked or not. You just, hit go. You just run the code that gets generated. Did it work or not? So the feedback loop for those companies, I'm so jealous of them in some ways because they must have millions of people every day across the world telling them this didn't work, and that's really golden data for people developing an AI system. With us, we have far fewer users. We have a much longer turnaround time. It's not necessarily so obvious whether something's correct or not. And so, to me, like that's the frontier. Like that's the area that's evolving the fastest because of the volume and because of the incredible, clarity of what works and what doesn't. And so I'm really excited about that because that helps everybody, not just people in life sciences doing what we're doing, but everyone across the world who's coding anything. So I think that's a super. We're surfing that wave. We're all in on AI coding. It's already yielded incredible results for us. So that's really exciting. And I think it's just there's this succession of enhanced foundation models that are just making things better and better and easier for us. And so it's expanding the scope and accelerating the pace at which we can innovate. And so that's really exciting. I think that I know there are people out there saying, "Oh yeah, we're only 2 to 5 years away from AGI, artificial general intelligence, meaning intelligence that actually is, like indistinguishable in many important ways from humans." And so we're going to be in this process of basically usurping ourselves as being the supposedly most intelligent species on this planet. But I think that that's overblown. Like my opinion is that there's always been hype around AI since the 1950s. And it's always been 20 years away, and now it's like 2 to 5 years away. But I think that if you really look under the covers at the way these language models work, they have a ways to go. And if you look at some of these tests out there in terms of, oh, is it really intelligent? Can it really innovate? Can it really solve problems that humans can? It starts falling flat pretty quickly. There are some pretty significant fundamental limitations to what large language models are capable of. That said, they are capable of a lot.
Yeah, exactly. What's your take on there's a huge narrative on software engineering, where it's going to go as an industry, and you've touched on a couple of points there around AGI being 2 to 5 years away. What do you think the development of some of these AI coding tools will do for the industry? And what I mean by that is the industry going to contract, or is it going to continue to expand just purely on the right people being in the right positions, actually looking after what code is actually being generated and ensuring it's got the right
Yeah.
scalability, security, reliability? Will it actually expand the industry or contract it?
You know, this is a disruptive innovation wave that is very significant in scope and maybe, yeah, larger in scale than others we've seen before. But these things tend to follow a certain pattern, right? Where for a while, everybody is really full of fear they're going to lose their jobs. Everything's changing underneath them. We're still figuring out what this means. We're like at the 1996 level of, if you think back to the dot-com era of how things went down. And so it's still early stages. These systems have only been in broad use for a couple of years, and so I think, yes, there will be situations where people who have built their entire careers doing things a certain way and, having a certain skill set are completely obsolete. And that may well result in a lot of people losing their jobs. However, in the longer run, meaning the next sort of 3 to 5 years plus, it's just going to be a period of adjustment where everyone needs to learn how to use these tools. Everyone needs to know how to use Cursor or whatever the year 2030 equivalent of Cursor is, using GPT-7 or whatever. Everyone's going to need to know how to use that. And as a result, the productivity and the capabilities of any given user are going to be much augmented. And moreover, I think that the barrier to entry and the kinds of skills and qualities that are necessary to be a really successful professional in the space are going to shift. And they're going to shift away from, you know, specific knowledge of APIs and specific experience implementing certain types of systems, and more towards curiosity and imagination, creativity, communication skills. And that's a really interesting shift. It's going to, I think, in some ways, move us more towards being entrepreneurs and artists rather than technicians. And I think ultimately that's a good thing because these are more fundamentally human qualities. And the other things are going to be increasingly automated and being taken care of by the AI.
Yeah, 100%. I think I've been speaking about this a lot with people, but the rule book is somewhat changing, as in size of organizations. People are now focusing on revenue per employee as opposed to let's grow to a phenomenal amount of people and we actually aren't generating any profit, or even in some cases, just spending VC money building businesses that don't generate revenue. So I think the rule book is changing almost where you can actually build a business with 10, 15, 20 people with enormous hockey stick growth because of the tools available to us. And I do think that route will continue to take some more momentum.
Yeah, I mean, there's precedent for this, right? Like on a smaller scale, but you think back to the cloud revolution. Like in the old days, it was really, really hard to host a website. Any sort of SaaS system required like an Oracle database and like this super expensive Netscape enterprise server or whatever. And then you got to think about where to host everything, like rack space. And now you don't even think about that stuff anymore. Really, you just pay a pretty modest bill to whatever hosting provider and you're done. And I think it's going to be, and as a result of that, it lowered the bar for innovating, for creating a new startup that's some kind of SaaS service or some consumer e-commerce service or whatever. Like it just took care of a whole bunch of things, so you could focus your technical team, your product team on building actual product using all these kind of platforms and APIs. And I think it's going to be the same thing here, where you'll need even fewer people to create like a new startup. And has that resulted in fewer startups? No, it's resulted in more startups. Um, Now, maybe you might have to sort of prove your startup faster, or there'll be sort of higher expectations because of all of this, vibe coding and ability to create these prototypes really rapidly. And we're seeing that both in the entrepreneurial space with early stage startups, as well as actually even in enterprise sales with companies, vendors quickly prototyping, very functional systems that meet the customer's needs, and so on. But I think that giving people more power and the ability to innovate faster is always in the medium to long term going to be a much better thing for
Yeah,
everybody.
I totally agree. I totally agree with that. Before we wrap up, you touched on it earlier in terms of Faro Health and the types of people and the types of skills that you're looking for. Great opportunity to talk to a community of people that listen to us here on Engineers. Where might you be growing the business in the future, and what skills will you be looking to attract into the team?
Well, as a technology product development company, we will be looking for software engineers, data scientists, product managers, UXers that are able to really effectively wield generative AI in order to do their jobs. And so that's the way of things. That's the way it's going, is that we will be looking for people who either have direct experience, ideally, with doing these things and can point to projects that have built with the help of AI much faster than they otherwise would have, or have the kind of personal qualities that we look for that the kinds of people that do that have, like curiosity, creativity, like a real focus on executing and delivering things quickly and so on.
Love it. If you're an AI native person, if you're an AI native thinker, or have some of those traits, you should definitely reach out to Patrick and Faro Health. They're going to be growing the business. They're going to be growing some really interesting, innovative things in the life sciences space. Patrick, Thanks so much for coming to join us. I do really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Elliot. I really enjoyed the conversation. And of course, people can come visit our website at farohealth.com or come and see me on LinkedIn. It's easy to find me. It's been a real pleasure being on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Career sites below for everyone as well. And of course, the likes, shares, subscribership, all that good stuff keeps this little ecosystem buzzing around. So do that, Patrick. Thanks so much. Bye for now.
Take care.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this episode. Massively appreciate you listening and checking in with us. If you want to find out more about us and what we're doing, please check us out on social media. What we're trying to do at Engineers is build a community to drive knowledge sharing and experiences. On Twitter, we can be found Engineers.io. It's no underscore. We've also got a website which is engineers.io. These links will all be posted in the description. Any feedback and comments are massively appreciated. We're always looking to improve on where we can. Thanks, guys.